Hello everyone! So, I'll be talking about brush blend modes, knowing when to use them, what they are, how to use them. We first need to think about the painting process in general. So, painting is a very iterative process. It's basically just adding strokes and swatches of paint to the current image so that it becomes a better painting. But you never really know what the next color you should use, what the next stroke should be. It's always relative to the current state of your painting. That's why when you ask artists about, color theory, is this the correct color? Is this RGB value the next color that I should pick? The question doesn't make sense. An artist can't really help you if you ask that question, because you can only correctly judge what strokes or color work best only after you see it. And since we have undo in digital art, we have unlimited tries to check which color or stroke work best. So think about it this way. Each stroke is like a puzzle piece. It's lots of trial and error to see which pieces fit together, and if they do fit, do they help in completing the picture. Using blend mode is like making sure the piece that you're testing out will work with what you already have, because with blend modes, as the name suggests, of course, it's often going to blend better compared to just using the normal blend mode, which just puts the color on top and doesn't do anything special. So when you think about color theory or painting in general, you really need to think about like 3 dimensions, which is value, saturation, and hue. But it's kind of hard to think about painting in 3 dimensions. So people often try to simplify it in only 2 dimensions, or in most, digital art software, we often think about it in 2 dimensions, but with 1 slider outside the 2-dimensional space. So here is what you usually, in most digital art software, you often see the triangle. Maybe sometimes this is like a square, but oftentimes it's a triangle. And on the y-axis, you have the value. So when you move up the y-axis, things become brighter. And on the x-axis, you have saturation, which is how intense the colors are. Then at a different slider, you have the hue, which you can control independently of these 2 variables, right? So when you think about painting, it's often balancing what dimensions you want to go in. If I say, think about the value, like, hey, on this painting, the value is correct, but the colors aren't. So which part do I need to change? Do I just need to change the saturation? Do I need to make the color weaker and less vibrant? Or do I need to change it into something cooler or warmer? Depends on your situation, right? So blend modes is just another way of navigating that 3-dimensional space with more control. Say I only want to change the value. I only want to make something brighter or darker. I use this blend mode and this blend mode. If I only want to change the color, I use this blend mode. And in blend modes, there's usually 3 groups. There's the darken group, the mix group, and the lighten group. You can, of course, go over to Krita and go over on the blend modes categories. They would look like this when you open the blend modes over here on the layers panel or on the layers docker. When you click on normal, you'll often see this darken group, this lighten group, and this mix group. And there's a lot, actually. That's why they have this favorites, so it's less daunting for you to look at. But yeah, it's still a lot in favorites, but I'll try to simplify things so that you'll generally know which blend mode to use. And some of these are like just synonyms of each other, which makes things easier. So going back here on the darken group, those are like what categories are called, but there's also an actual blend mode called darken, or in Photoshop it's called darker color. They pretty much work the same way. So it only chooses to change the bright colors. And that's what you generally need to think about when thinking about these groups. So the darken group generally targets bright areas. So it really wants to change those bright areas into something darker. But the darker parts, they don't generally change all that much. So it will have a minimal effect on those darker areas. And the opposite is true for the lighting group, which really tries to target the darker areas and tries to lift them up and makes them a little bit brighter. But for already lighter areas of the painting, they generally don't change. And for the mix group, it's kind of both, but I often think about using mix group as a way to control the color than just trying to change the value. But of course, using overlay or hard light as the brush blend mode, you can kind of change both the brightness and the color. So it works by kind of navigating all 3D space at once. So for overlay and hard light, they're a bit harder, a bit more difficult to master. But if you do eventually master it and learn how to control it, it's a really powerful tool to use when, painting. I use it all the time. But to simplify things, let's first start with darken group and lighten group. So I have here a painting of a ball. And so let's think about our first use case. I want to change the color of our light source. So I'm going to add a new layer. Then I'll fill this with color, yellow, bright yellow. Then I'm going to go over here on the layers docker and change normal to darker or darken. And now you can see it only changed the bright areas because we're in the darken group, which means it only targets the bright areas, right? But all the darker areas, it doesn't change anything to them at all. And now since, I have this blend mode active, I can just change the color of the layer. Say I want it to be more red, and that's how it changes it. Maybe something like a hot pink, that's how it changes it. So it only changes the bright areas. And now, since we have this, let's also try to change the color of the shadows. So since we have hot pink, or say, let's make this orange or yellowish, I guess. But let's add a purple tint to our shadows. So I'm gonna add a new layer. And since we're targeting the shadows, can you remember which group we need to think about? And the correct answer is, of course, the lighten group, since it's only going to target the darker areas. And we go over here on the layers docker again and go to the lighten group, and let's go to lighten. Now I want it to be more purple, so I'm gonna add the purple color. That's way too strong, and also the color that we chose is way too bright. Let's try to make it darker, and there we have a slightly more balanced color. So we have a slightly tinted purple to our shadows, while the highlights are more slightly tinted yellow or orange. If I turn off this one, you can see it's kind of the inverse of what we just did a while ago with darken, which it only changes the darker areas of the painting. Now, these two, like lighten and darken, I don't often use them, but in those specific cases, they're really useful when they only want to change the light source or the shadow color, right? But it also works the same way with the other blend modes in the same group, which is multiply or color burn or screen and color dodge. So let's first start with the darkening group. Instead of darken, let's try using multiply. And let's go to multiply. It changes everything now, but the darker areas aren't as affected as much. And you can see that by erasing some of this. So let's erase this. So from here, this is the color that we have, right? This gray, this relatively bright gray, turned into this. That's a really huge leap in terms of value, because it came from all the way here to all the way here. But now let's look at the shadow colors. It came from here to here. So it only changed only a slight bit. So it's only this much distance covered. But in the light areas, it changed from here to here. Oh wait, so I erased the part of this, but let's actually look at the values and not the colors for a bit. So I transferred this, or like I converted it into a black and white image, which looks like this. And now when I color pick, if I go to the bright areas, so this is the color of the bright areas, then I go to the changed bright area, the difference is huge. So it's like a quarter of the whole like y-axis, right? Or the value axis. It's a quarter leap or something like that. But if we look at the darker areas from here to here, the difference is still huge, right? But it's only, or like 1/16 of a step. So that's what happens when you use multiply instead of darken. So instead of only affecting the bright areas, it also affects the darker areas, but it's only going to change it ever so slightly darker. And the same is true with color burn. So let's go back here, change this to color burn, go to there. The notable difference is, of course, the intensity of the colors. In multiply, only tries to tint the color that you use. So since I used orange for this, it only tints it slightly. But for color burn, it really tries to like inject that color into the affected pixels, right? And you know, that's kind of like the slight variations between those three, which is if you want more color and at the same time you want it to become darker, then you choose for color burn. But if you only want it to be darker as well as affect those darker areas, you need to use multiply. But if you only want to change the bright areas and nothing else, then you need to use darken. But generally, those three all affect the bright areas generally the same way, right? And of course, I could go on, but the same is true for lighten and screen and color dodge, which you can see here on the lighten group. So let's try color dodge. You can see here, another thing I forgot to mention is when you use, say, a black color and you use it for lighten, it doesn't do anything. But if we say change it a bit, make it a little bit brighter, nothing still happens, nothing still happens, nothing still happens. Oh wait, there's a slight change, right? When we took this step, there's a slight change. If we make it brighter, even bigger change, make it brighter, even bigger change, make it brighter, even bigger change. So when it's full black and you're using something from the lighten group, nothing really happens. But the opposite is true for the darken group. If you use pure white in darken group, so let's use darken, but instead of pure black, let's use pure white, nothing happens. But again, if you use pure black, everything is going to be affected. And once you try and like make it brighter, only some parts are affected. Now let's go back to color dodge. There. So color dodge, let's try to use a slightly mid-tone color, something like that. So the same way with burn, but the opposite, it makes it brighter, but also injects a lot of color into the affected areas. If we go to screen, which is, you know, multiplies like cousin or like inverse cousin. Let's go to screen. The insertion of that color that you used isn't as strong. It's more so just a tint or a slight hint of color when you use screen. But of course, you can also try to make it more saturated to bump up that intensity of color. But yeah, in general, you wouldn't really use screen if you really want like a really vibrant punch of color. And of course, lighten, same thing. It only affects the darker areas, but not the light areas, which we already discussed. Now, let's go to the mix group, which is kind of both, but the more constrained version of this group is the color. And the same thing, Krita, is instead of going to darken or lighten, let's go to mix. There you can see the different like mix blend modes. The most popular is, of course, normal. overlay, color, and hard mix, or hard light and soft light. I'm not sure if soft light is over here. I don't think it is, but sometimes people use that in Photoshop instead of overlay. It's kind of like a slightly different version of overlay. So let's go to color. But here in mix, the color blend mode isn't here, but you can always go to favorites and it's always going to be there. If you want like to see which category it is, you can just go check this like HSI, HSL versions. Apparently it's on HSY, and that's where you can see the color blend mode. But yeah, it's already in favorites, so you don't have to go over to the blend mode categories. So let's choose color, and I'm gonna select the circle, and I'm gonna add, say, green to it. So now we have a green ball. In color, like the value is slightly different. That's why it's like a mix, right? Some parts get brighter, some parts get darker depending on what you use. But in general, the main use case for using something like color or overlay or a hard mix or hard light, is to generally control the color as well, besides the value compared to darken and lighten. So besides changing the color, it's also quite useful for adding texture or something that's like superimposed in an object, say something like a label or a writing. It's really great for that. To show you what I mean, instead of adding layers, I'm gonna use it on my brush, which is over here on somewhere on the toolbar. I'm gonna use overlay. So now, if I say start writing something, let's add this one. So overlay, you can see it's as if it was written on the surface, right? So let's constrain this to a layer instead. Now let's add, let's write overlay over here. You can barely see it. And that's the problem when you write stuff or like try to add stuff on top of already existing forms and like objects. You can't just write something and expect it to be visible, right? So if I use overlay instead, now we kind of have that clear visibility that something is written on this ball. It's like as if they took this ball and got a permanent mark and written all over it. And the same is true for hard light, hard mix, but only slightly different. Hard mix softer, the same thing, or hard light. Besides superimposed stuff, let's try and add some cracks over here. Instead of the layer, I'm gonna go back to brush and use the hard light. By the way, if you want to use blend modes at like really quickly, or if you've seen me use this, I'll link this into the description. It's a plugin for Krita, which you can map, like it has a specific hotkey for commonly used blend modes, which you can use while painting, which is really, really cool. But besides that, if you don't want a plugin, you can assign a key to the specific blend mode that you want for your brush. So I have it at hard light. Say I want to add some cracks over here. The beauty about using overlay, hard light, or the mix group in general, it only tries to change a little bit of what's already there. Compared to, say, if I used normal, right? All that time, I didn't change anything with the color. I only used this specific shade of gray and started painting. But if I use normal for this, and if I try to paint over here, you can see I can't, like, it's not going to be visible. If I use hard light, which I just changed right now, it ensures that it's going to be visible. There's going to be that change. You know, that's really the perfect use case for the mix group, which is if you already have a shaded object, but you're only trying to add a bit of detail, a bit of surface area detail onto that object or onto that form, you're gonna have a much easier time painting those details in by going into the mix group and like choosing either overlay, hard mix, or a hard light. Okay, one final caveat. I should have put this like way earlier, but blend modes aren't really useful in like the first few steps of the painting. If you're like blocking out stuff, generally establishing value guidelines, say for example over here on my painting, if we go back a fair bit over here, if you're using blend modes at this kind of rough stage, you'll be having a hard time, because since you're using blend modes, it tries to, as much as possible, keep the existing relationships, like the value and color relationships that you already have in your painting. It tries to maintain that. But in a blocking out stage where you're trying to establish these broad strokes of value and color, you kind of want to constrain specific areas to this dark of a value or this light of a value. It's not going to be useful, because there's lots of drastic changes that's going to happen or that are happening. But when you're much later on, like you're already at this stage, right? You only want to add like surface detail. For example, over here on the road or on the street, I used like hard light for this, or maybe overlay. You can also use screen or lighten to add that kind of bit of surface texture to that street. I already have like the established value guidelines of the entire street. Like this general area is this block of gray, and it's not going to change all that much on that gray. I'm using blend modes on those areas where I only want like a slight bit of change, or I only want a slight bit of color. Blend modes really shine on those situations. But yeah, so blend modes are really for like the second half of painting, where you're polishing and you're refining, and like you already have a solid painting, but you just want to change it a little bit. So you're not gonna have a lot of use for it if you use it at the very beginning stages of a painting. So keep that in mind. And I think that pretty much covers it all. You are now very much well equipped to use blend modes on your next painting, or use layer blend modes to your next painting. And if you've gotten this far, make sure to leave a like. And if you want to see more videos like this one, make sure to subscribe. And if you want to see a video where I talk about edge control, like specific edges, soft edges, hard edges, make sure to watch this video over here. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.